Hope had not intended to overhear anything at all. Her visit to Spencer Publications that afternoon had been ordinary, almost mechanical, driven by habit rather than expectation. The building had always carried a sense of controlled urgency, its glass walls and muted corridors designed to project confidence and permanence. It was a place where power circulated quietly, disguised as productivity, and Hope had walked those halls enough times to feel invisible within them. That invisibility, however, became the very condition that allowed her to stumble into a truth she would never have sought. Willingly, the voices reached her before she recognized them, sharp and tightly restrained, vibrating with the tension of a conversation that had been simmering long before it reached the surface. She slowed instinctively, her body responding before her mind could intervene. Liam's voice carried a frustration she had never heard so nakedly expressed. Stripped of its usual caution, it was not anger in the explosive sense, but something colder and more corrosive, resentment that had been allowed to ferment unchecked. He spoke of Brooke not with cruelty, but with exhaustion, as though her presence had become an immovable weight pressing down on every structure around her. To him, Brooke was not merely a mother or a matriarch, but a gravitational force that bent every orbit toward herself, leaving no room for anyone else to exist without reference to her. Hope felt a tightening in her chest as she listened, the words settling into her with an intimacy that made retreat impossible. Liam's disappointment unfolded methodically, each sentence revealing a long-held belief that Brooke had monopolized influence within both the Forrester and Logan families. He spoke as though this dominance were not earned through resilience or vision, but hoarded, maintained by habit and deference rather than merit. The implication was subtle but devastating, that Brooke's centrality was less a testament to her strength than a failure of others to challenge her. Hope, frozen just beyond the doorway, felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This was not casual venting. This was a redefinition of her mother's role, one that reframed decades of sacrifice and leadership as an obstacle rather than a foundation. Katie's response arrived not as resistance but as affirmation. Her voice carried a calm conviction that startled Hope more than Liam's bitterness ever could. Katie did not argue the premise, she expanded it. She spoke of opportunity, of timing, of the inevitability of change when power grows too concentrated. Her words were measured, strategic, and unmistakably intentional. The company she was building, she suggested, was not merely a personal venture but a counterweight, a mechanism through which the balance of influence could finally be adjusted. Hope felt a chill as she understood the implication. This was not about independence alone. It was about dismantling the authority Brooke and Ridge had come to represent within Forrester, weakening them not through direct confrontation but through calculated erosion. As the conversation deepened, Hope's shock hardened into something more painful and more precise. Katie framed her ambitions not as betrayal, but as evolution, suggesting that institutions thrive only when no single figure is allowed to dominate indefinitely. She spoke of redefining narratives, of shifting loyalties, of creating a new center of gravity that no longer revolved around Brooke's decisions or Ridge's legacy. The language was clinical, almost academic, yet its intent was unmistakable. This was a strategy, not a grievance. And Liam was not merely listening, he was participating. He offered suggestions, raised concerns, and most devastatingly, expressed willingness to act. Hope felt her breath catch as realization crystallized into certainty. Liam was not a passive supporter nodding along to Katie's ambitions. He was actively invested, emotionally and intellectually, in a plan that would harm her mother. The betrayal cut deeper because it did not arrive in the form of cruelty or malice, but in quiet consensus. Liam spoke of Brooke as a problem to be managed, an influence to be diminished for the greater good of progress. The man Hope had once believed incapable of such calculated disloyalty was now revealing a side of himself shaped by resentment and ambition rather than empathy. Time seemed to distort as Hope stood there, absorbing the implications of every word. Her mind raced backward through memory, re-examining moments she had once dismissed as insignificant. Liam's occasional detachment, his growing alignment with Katie, the subtle distancing whenever Brooke asserted herself. These had not been isolated incidents but symptoms of a shift already underway. The realization left Hope numb, her grief not explosive but paralyzing. It was one thing to believe that external forces threatened her family. It was another entirely to discover that the danger had taken root within the relationships she trusted most. What unsettled Hope most was not the ambition itself, but the moral framing surrounding it. Neither Liam nor Katie spoke of revenge or punishment. They spoke of inevitability, of necessity, of balance. In doing so, they stripped their actions of emotional accountability, recasting harm as progress and betrayal as reform. Hope recognized the danger in that logic immediately. It was the kind that allowed people to justify anything as long as it could be positioned as beneficial in the abstract. Brooke, reduced to a symbol of stagnation in their narrative, became expendable. Hope's thoughts turned instinctively to her mother, to the woman who had carried the weight of both families with unrelenting resolve. Brooke had never sought dominance for its own sake. Her influence had grown because she filled vacuums others were unwilling or unable to occupy. To hear her leadership reframed as tyranny felt like a profound distortion. One that ignored the emotional labor, the sacrifices, and the cost of always being the one expected to hold everything together. Hope felt a surge of protectiveness collide with disbelief. How could Liam, who had witnessed Brooke's strength firsthand, so easily reduce her to an obstacle? The conversation ended without resolution, its participants unaware of the witness standing just beyond their reach. When their voices finally faded, Hope remained rooted in place, her body refusing to move as though motion itself would shatter the fragile coherence she was struggling to maintain. The hallway felt colder, narrower, as though the building had closed in around her. She understood then that innocence, once lost, could not be recovered. The knowledge she now carried would alter every interaction, every assumption, every expression of trust. Hope walked away eventually, her steps slow and deliberate, each one weighted with the gravity of what she had learned. She did not confront Liam or Katie, not because she lacked courage, but because she needed time to understand the full scope of the betrayal. This was not a single act of disloyalty. It was a philosophical divergence, a fundamental disagreement about who deserved power and why. Liam had chosen a side, and it was not the one Hope had believed him to stand on. As she left Spencer Publications, the city outside felt strangely indifferent, continuing its rhythm without regard for the fracture that had just occurred. Hope felt isolated in a way she never had before, standing at the intersection of loyalty and truth with no clear path forward. She knew that exposing the conversation would ignite conflict, that silence would enable harm, and that either choice would carry irreversible consequences. The realization settled heavily into her chest. The greatest threats to her family were no longer external forces or rival companies, but the quiet decisions made behind closed doors by people who believed themselves justified. Hope understood that the balance of power within the Forrester and Logan worlds was already shifting. Not through dramatic coups but through calculated alignment. Liam's disappointment, Katie's ambition, and Brooke's perceived dominance had converged into a narrative powerful enough to reshape reality, if left unchallenged. And now, armed with this knowledge, Hope faced her own reckoning. She could no longer afford neutrality. The moment demanded clarity, resolve, and the willingness to confront betrayal even when it wore the face of love. The echo of Liam's words followed her long after she left the building. Each syllable a reminder that allegiance is never guaranteed, even within family. Hope knew that the coming days would force her to choose between preserving peace and defending truth, and as the weight of that choice settled over her, she realized with quiet certainty that nothing, not love, not loyalty, not history, would ever feel as secure again. Sheila's warning had never been theatrical, and that was precisely what made it dangerous. When she had first made it clear that her marriage to Deacon was not to be interfered with, there had been no raised voice, no dramatic threat, no visible display of violence. Instead, her words had been delivered with unsettling calm, the kind that suggested certainty rather than bluster. Sheila was not a woman who threatened casually. She believed in inevitability, in consequences that arrived not because they were announced, but because they were engineered. Those who mistook her restraint for weakness had always paid the price eventually. And when Taylor began to drift closer to Deacon, Sheila did not see romance or confusion. She saw trespass. At first, the shift between Taylor and Deacon was subtle enough to be dismissed by anyone unwilling to look too closely. Their conversations lingered longer than necessary. Their shared history, once spoken of cautiously, began to resurface with warmth rather than caution. What had started as mutual understanding hardened into emotional reliance, the kind that grows quietly in the shadow of loneliness and exhaustion. Taylor, burdened by years of self-control and sacrifice, found comfort in Deacon's attention, while Deacon, long starved for stability and validation, leaned into the familiarity she offered. Neither of them believed they were doing anything wrong. That belief would become their greatest vulnerability. Sheila noticed everything. She noticed the way Deacon's attention drifted, the way his phone habits changed, the way his tone softened when Taylor's name surfaced in conversation. She noticed the emotional absence before it became physical distance, and she understood immediately what it meant. For Sheila, marriage was not simply a bond of affection. It was a claim, a declaration of territory that she believed had been earned through endurance and survival. Deacon was not just her husband. He was proof that she could still win, still be chosen, still occupy the center of someone's world. The idea that Taylor could erode that position, even unintentionally, ignited a fury that Sheila did not allow to surface all at once. Sheila did not confront Taylor immediately. Direct confrontation was for people who wanted resolution. Sheila wanted dominance. Instead, she began to observe, to collect, to map the emotional topography of the situation. She understood that exposure alone could be as destructive as physical harm, and often more enduring. A scandal, once released, could not be contained again. It spread through families, reputations, institutions, staining everything it touched. Sheila had always been adept at understanding how systems collapsed, and she recognized that Taylor's strength lay in her image, stability, professionalism, moral authority. To damage Taylor, Sheila would not need to strike her physically. She only needed to fracture the perception that protected her. The plan formed gradually, shaped by patience rather than impulse. Sheila knew that if she moved too quickly, she would reveal herself. If she moved too slowly, the relationship between Taylor and Deacon might solidify into something harder to dismantle. Timing was essential. She began planting seeds, whispering suggestions into carefully chosen ears, allowing suspicion to bloom organically rather than appear orchestrated. A misplaced photograph, a carefully edited message, a suggestion framed as concern rather than accusation. Sheila understood that people trusted discoveries more than confessions. At the same time, Sheila prepared an alternative outcome, one darker and more dangerous. Exposure was effective, but fear was transformative. If public scandal failed to sever the connection between Taylor and Deacon, then Taylor herself would need to be removed as a variable. Sheila did not frame this as violence in her own mind, but as correction. To her, Taylor's presence represented disruption, and disruption demanded containment. The idea that Taylor might be frightened, destabilized, or placed in a position where retreat became the only option felt justified, even necessary. Sheila believed that protecting her marriage required eliminating threats, and she had never been constrained by conventional morality. The consequences of Sheila's plan were never going to be isolated. She understood that fully. The families surrounding Taylor and Deacon were tightly interwoven, bound by shared history, children, careers, and public reputation. Any attempt to expose or endanger Taylor would ripple outward, touching Steffi, Ridge, Finn, and others whose lives were already strained by past trauma. Sheila did not see this as collateral damage. She saw it as leverage. Pain, when distributed widely, distracted from its source. Chaos made accountability difficult, and in chaos, Sheila thrived. As rumors began to surface, the atmosphere around Taylor shifted perceptibly. Conversations grew guarded. Invitations felt conditional. Whispers followed her through spaces that had once felt safe. Taylor sensed the change without immediately understanding its origin. She questioned her own instincts, attributing discomfort to guilt rather than manipulation. Deacon, too, felt the pressure mounting, though he struggled to articulate it. The more they attempted to retreat into discretion, the more conspicuous their bond became. Sheila watched this with grim satisfaction, knowing that suspicion often intensified when people tried hardest to appear innocent. When the first piece of fabricated evidence surfaced, it was devastating in its plausibility. It did not prove an affair outright, but it suggested intimacy, secrecy, and intent. The timing was impeccable, coinciding with moments of public visibility that amplified its impact. Taylor's professional standing began to wobble as questions arose about boundaries and ethics. Deacon found himself under scrutiny not only as a husband, but as a man whose past already made him vulnerable to judgment. Sheila allowed the narrative to unfold without overt interference. Her fingerprints invisible, her presence untraceable. Yet even as the plan succeeded, Sheila felt no relief. Victory did not soothe her. It sharpened her appetite. The possibility that Taylor might weather the storm, that Deacon might still choose her despite scandal and danger, gnawed at Sheila's sense of control. That fear pushed her toward escalation. The second phase of her plan unfolded not as exposure but as intimidation. A moment engineered to remind Taylor that safety was conditional, that boundaries once crossed could not simply be redrawn without consequence. The threat did not need to be explicit. It only needed to be credible. A sense of being watched. A reminder of vulnerability. The suggestion that the line between reputation and physical harm was thinner than Taylor had ever imagined. Taylor began to unravel under the combined weight of fear and guilt. She questioned her judgment relentlessly, wondering whether her desire for comfort had endangered not only herself but everyone she loved. The families around her felt the strain acutely. Steffi's anxiety deepened. Ridge's protectiveness intensified into suspicion. Finn's medical instincts picked up on behavioral shifts that could not be easily explained. The emotional ecosystem surrounding Taylor destabilized rapidly, each person responding to the perceived threat in ways that further amplified tension. Deacon, trapped between loyalty and fear, struggled to understand how everything had spiraled so quickly. He sensed Sheila's presence even when she was not physically near, her influence lingering like a pressure system that altered emotional weather. He knew, on some level, that Sheila's warning had not been empty, and the realization filled him with dread. The marriage he had believed to be a source of redemption now felt like a battleground, one where every choice carried the risk of devastation. As the situation deteriorated, it became clear that Sheila's plan was not designed to end cleanly. There was no version of events in which everyone emerged intact. Exposure would leave lasting scars. Fear would fracture trust permanently. Even if Taylor withdrew completely, the damage inflicted would linger, reshaping relationships long after Sheila declared victory. This was not collateral damage to Sheila. It was proof of effectiveness. What Sheila underestimated, however, was the resilience of those she sought to control. Fear did not paralyze Taylor indefinitely. It sharpened her awareness. Slowly, painfully, she began to recognize the pattern, the orchestration beneath the chaos. The realization did not bring comfort, but it brought clarity. Sheila's warning had been a promise, and the promise had been kept. The question that remained was not whether Sheila was capable of destruction, but how far she was willing to go now that her hand had been revealed. By the time the truth began to surface, the cost was already immense. Families were divided, trust had eroded, reputations lay in fragments, and at the center of it all stood Sheila, convinced that she had acted not out of malice, but necessity. In her mind, love justified cruelty, and protection justified terror. She had not destroyed her marriage to save it. She had destroyed everything around it to prove it mattered. The aftermath offered no easy resolution. Exposure did not undo fear. Accountability did not restore innocence. The damage Sheila unleashed reshaped lives permanently, leaving behind a landscape altered by paranoia, grief, and moral reckoning. And as the families struggled to piece together what remained, one truth became undeniable. Sheila's warning had never been about boundaries alone. It had been a declaration of war. One fought not with noise or spectacle, but with precision, patience, and a devastating understanding of how deeply fear could penetrate the human heart. What followed was not peace, but silence, heavy, watchful, and irrevocably changed.